International Trade, Module 2, the competitive advantage of nations, nation of economic globalization managed. Economic globalization that we are witnessing today has shown a visible change in more traditional schemes of the analysis of strategic management. Together with the study of competitive environments and competitive advantage, the new rules of competition on the international scale, shift the weight of the cost in any of the phases of the scale of production, labor, transportation, the redefinition of the distance and geographical location. All this equals the revolution in the strategic approaches and pursuit of competitive advantage. Western economies have stood out in terms of competitive strategies of their companies. They have progressed to the point where they have brought a change in the customized cost of various activities that made up the production value chain, thus producing an excessive increase in the cost of labor. In addition, the process of economic globalization in particular has led to a breakdown of the concept of market and production, whether local or national, as well as the creation of an international management area that promotes access to areas of economic development with lower production costs than to obtaining cheap labor, thanks to obtaining cheap labor. The economic globalization, the movement of economic globalization is an adaptation to the needs and limitations of obsolete processing production models. At the same time, it implies reversing the trends towards competitive strategic trends based on differentiation, which had enjoyed great prominence at that moment. The cost strategy and differentiation evolution and changes, the beginning of strategic thinking arise linked to the idea of intrinsic positive aspects of the cost strategy. The study and the definition of competitive strategy in relationship to the economic activity or business group has revolved around two key variables, cost strategy and differentiation strategy. Both are used as a competitive advantage over competitors in a given sector. The choice of one or another of these two rules was perceived as exclusive since there was tension between cost reduction and product differentiation, as it was observed that there was a tendency to increase production costs when trying to get a competitive advantage based on differentiation. And by the way, here they're talking about differentiation being superiority of the product. This need for change emerges due to the increasing complexity of the market. In the previous market models, the concept of competition was much simpler, as the power of competitiveness was based on the final price of the product. Competitive advantage. This situation led to a strategic cost policy being established as the ultimate goal of strategic planning, and thus facilitated the emergence of more primitive theories derived from this cost strategy, such as the study of experience curve as engineering to achieve a cost reduction. The need to change gave rise to the new trend in business research, which analyzed the competitive cost structure in a more elaborate, fragmented, specified, and detailed way, making a distinction between different activities that made up the value chain of that industry, organization, and the company. The objective of this new orientation is to specify in a more concrete and balanced manner the real importance of each production stage in the terms of the final result, and also the need for achievement. In this way, we can get a clearer idea of the option of actions in the cost reduction policy. With this mechanism, in addition to a reduction in the final cost of the product and an increase in the value added will be achieved. It can be said that in this phase, the cost strategy presents more complex and precise study tools aimed at achieving greater precision than the previous one. This period is of crucial importance since it begins with the analysis of the activities in the McKinsey business system and ends with the theoretician included in the Porter's value chain. Now let's look at the policy of differentiation. The next phase of historical proliferation of the interrelation between the cost strategy and the differentiation strategy arises with the emergency of the policy of differentiation as a key concept for business management. Moreover, this moment is linked to a stage of evolution in the maturity of the market and the appearance of greater competitive pressure. And at the same time, we should take note of the universalization of production models, technological advances, imitation techniques, etc. Therefore, entrepreneurs need to resort to alternative actions such as the search for differentiation as the only element of real competitive strategy. Once all of the competitive advantages related to cost reduction have been exhausted, the strategic management studies state that differentiation is the only strategy to create an effective and efficient competitive advantage. It's because differentiation is directly associated with other phases, which like marketing, training, logistics, research, customer support. We've talked about this in the past. Technological innovation and so on, and that benefit from greater flexibility and a scope for actions in the economic structures of the most developed countries. Other basic elements of differentiation policy are brand, advertising, design, company services. I mentioned this already, customer service, after-sales service, etc. All of them create an added value which absorbs higher production costs and therefore the final price increases. Generalization of differentiation. The phase clarifies a phenomenon called generalization of differentiation, which identifies differentiation as the basic idea of strategic management in all sectors of production. This phenomenon is called the plague of indifference by Peters, who explains that excessive differentiation creates an homogenization of the differentiation, an event that is not positive for the competitive advantage. It effectively eliminates it. This concept arises in a situation of market saturation where the competition is big and it is extremely hard to find the competitive advantage in an economic sector. Likewise, the classic strategic management techniques were lacking viability when applied to the contemporary business realities. Economic globalization and competitive strategy. The economic globalization appears in the context of fluctuation of cost policy and differentiation, altering the traditional stubbornness of international competitive environments. One of the greatest impacts of economic globalization was the extreme increase in the labor market, which led to the reduction of production costs of the workforce. This factor was considered a great revolution in competitive strategy, since it's possible to start a new game of equilibrium in the relationship of the different elements to make up the production chain of any business process in such a way that it influences the economic activity itself, the competitive advantage between company and the other countries. Labor costs. The emergence of borderless workforces supply leads to the resolution of a number of uncertainties that appeared in capitalist production systems. Cost. Labor was the most expensive phase of the production process, which had to become the competitive restraint for developed countries, to the point where the rest of the elements of the production process, the technology, specialization, marketing, logistics, etc., were displaced. When it comes to rigidity, the stiffness or inflexibility was one of the most characteristic elements of this phase of production. The workforce was the phase that was most engaged in the final cost of the production, and the phase that had the best margin of variation. And then we come to insufficiency, the negative influence of the workforce or human resources on the final cost of the product and on the market orientation could not be balanced out by greater efficiency in the organization of the rest of the stages of the chain of production, insertion of new technology, successful marketing campaigns, introduction of economic and efficient logistics systems, market, etc. These are other things that could reduce costs, but they just couldn't overwhelm the main cost of labor. Insufficiency of all those limits. Now comes the emergence of the global labor market. The emergence of the global labor market implies control of the natural limitations of the production scheme, in which the workforce was very expensive, as well as the creation of added value by means of differentiation. Brand design, marketing, technology, management, etc. And restructuring the value granted to the different components of the chain of value of production. The cost produced by the geographical relocation is counterbalanced by the savings from using the work in other countries, since they grant very high profit margins. The emergence of the global market changes the relevance of other factors that were strategic objectives in business differentiation, advertising, marketing, etc. Now we come to the logistics sector. Another factor that drastically changed its focus was the emergence of the logistics sector with a global character. As with the labor market, the logistics sector has continued growing until separation between the local and international markets took place. The increased speed, reliability, security, control, quality, and forecasting of information flows in international logistics systems have led to a large influx of consumer markets and global production. In fact, the geographical distance has no longer been a limitation for the definition of production and consumption centers, and this enabled access to the low-cost labor market. It can be said that this logistic approach has been revolutionary and has become a key element in the implementation of international economic globalization. Since it has benefits associated with reduction of labor costs in the less developed countries, and it establishes production access to the great centers of consumption in the rich countries. International global economy equals cheaper labor, borderless management of the internal-external logistics. The theoretical concepts of the competitive strategy. Now we're going to elaborate on the impact of two previously mentioned variables, cheap labor and international logistics, using some theoretical assumptions related to the competitive strategies. Let's look now at the experience curve. The experience curve was a basic component in the company's search for cost reduction. The scenario of international economic globalization is a clear improvement of this tool of business competitiveness, since the incident of cost reduction through geographical relocation reduces the importance of the time factor in production, so that all countries that are new to international production movements can have a competitive positioning. It can be seen how, in this case, a reduction of the national experience curve is carried out as a factor that provides competitive advantage over other countries. Value chain production. Through the analysis of the value chain, it can be said that there is a tendency to nationalize the phases that make up this chain. There is a relocation of the elements associated with labor or with the purchase of raw materials for the production process. At the same time, a settlement of the original centers of production of other phases of the process is maintained, such as marketing and the technology, the quality, customer service, after sales, and so on. Nonetheless, relocation movements began to emerge in these phases of the process, going from one moment of basically industrial globalization economically to a more globalization flood, to which reaches the service sector. International Trade, Module 2, National Disintegration. This event of national disintegration of the production chain phases brings into focus a new factor in the process of planning the cost structure of the company, and therefore the national contribution of the house phase up to the final product. Nevertheless, at this point, it is necessary to consider the geographical factor as a key element responsible for the increase or decrease in production and costs. Here is a new international economic order, competitive strategies based on a policy of reducing labor costs through the search for countries where they are cheapest, human resources management. Geographical delocation as competitive strategy, international logistics is crucial for the international business strategy where the distances are not a limitation but an advantage. Differentiation. As it has already been emphasized in previous paragraphs, a key factor in the traditional competitive strategy was product differentiation. The truth is that the new period of international economic globalization and the significant reduction of costs that it entailed have brought about a change in the traditional approach towards cost strategy and differentiation strategy. Thus, there has been a tendency to prioritize the global cost leadership strategy over the differentiation strategy. Now, the consequences of economic globalization. Well, the economic globalization has led to some processes that can pose a threat to the strategic policy of differentiation. The most important point of these premises is the following. Imitation as a resource to reproduce production models or products so that they are favored by a low cost of a less developed country, which allows effective reproduction of this successful product. Immersed in this process of economic globalization, in which the great competitive advantage is the lower cost, it is necessary to consider that in an imminent period, this process will be generalized, and therefore competition in the international environment will increase, and so will the level of life of large production centers, and economic spend. We will reach a situation in which we have to start a process of differentiation again in order to overcome the generalization of the benefit of production costs. Generic strategies. Cost strategies, differentiation strategies, balance between the two results, double competitive advantage, lower cost, product differentiation. That's best of both worlds, isn't it? This type of strategy is an ideal scenario of strategic development since it involves a series of advantages associated with two types of strategy that are not mutually exclusive. Those companies that enjoy a model based on a strategic advantage of differentiation and added value, brand quality, design, technological innovation, and so on, can also have the competitive advantage of geographical relocation, and thus achieve the double competitive advantage. This is how tension between differentiation and low cost has been reduced. The strategic situation is a visible change in the representation of the traditional graphic of the general business strategy, since it allows a greater variability in the definition of strategic positioning of each company. This is accomplished through the more accessible approach to a lower cost structure, difficult to reach for some companies in their production centers of the most developed countries without leaving behind the lines of differentiation. The competitive advantage of nations. The new economic environment of economic globalism has also brought about a reorganization of the traditional concept of nations' competitive advantage. Although the basic idea of the approach are maintained, the current international economic reality has changed with respect to the development of this strategy. It is evident that the situation is in the US, Japan, Germany is not the same as it was a few years ago. The US trade and fiscal deficit, the Japanese banking and consumer crisis, the German economic lethargy. Such situations have resulted in a reconstruction of the competitive advantages. Although these nations still enjoy a high standard of living and a productive leadership, the attitude towards the competitive advantage has changed due to economic globalization, and therefore due to the breakdown of the relationship between the factors to make up the national competitive advantage. On the other hand, the competitiveness between companies has been transformed into a completely international framework and leaves aside the local concerns. Prove that cheap and abundant labor promotes economic growth and is synonymous with wealth for the countries that have become an economic power, China and India in the 21st century. However, this event is not the only reason for the development of these countries, nor does it solve the uncertainties and limitations of poverty, lack of infrastructure, and great deficiencies of social development in these countries that they still have. So, in conclusion, the economic globalization has initiated a change in the nature of the strategic competition, going from the search for differentiation as a model of competitive advantage to the access of low-cost labor markets, which allows going back to the competitive strategy based on reduction of production costs. Now we come to the workforce. Access to low-cost labor markets has enabled overcoming a limitation in the production system of the most developed countries, which has reached such saturation that they could not afford a strategy of reduction of production costs. International logistics. It has become a key factor that the new international economic organization, since it allows a union between the centers of production and consumption that are very far from each other, but geography has no longer been a limitation thanks to international logistics. Economic globalization has also increased strategic design as a fully international and global nature, leaving behind strategic national and sectoral strategic management. All these theoretical changes of the strategic management programs related to the emergence of economic globalization directly influence concepts such as the experience curve, the national competitive advantage, the value chain, the generic competitive strategies, economies of scale, etc. These need to be studied again, taking into account the new strategies of production and international trade. International trade depends on productive capacity of each country, the organizational efficiency, and the competitive advantage over the rest of the world's economy. international trade flows. And the removal of the geographic limitations among markets has generated the need to study the origins of the competitive advantage of countries in order to analyze the different international trade flows. Theories that study the competitive advantage, the macroeconomic level, exchange rates, public deficits, and interest rates, the production factors, high availability of natural resources, production factor, cheap labor, official policy, resources, protection, support for governments, business structure, organization, management, methods, and human resource management. This new scenario of economic globalization provides new strategies for the globalization of competition, and technological innovation, foreign investments, etc., which are very difficult to explain using the old criteria and theories. In the scenario, the new theory of Michael Porter appears representing a breakthrough in the research of the competitive advantage of nations. Through study, the complexity of this matter, in which so many internal and external elements of the economy collaborate, can be understood in a detailed and specific fashion. Here we come, Michael Porter, main premises. Here they are. Creation of competitiveness. The competitiveness of each country's national economy is not inborn or inherited, but it is created in contrast to all previous series. Dynamism. A national competitive advantage is dynamic and flexible. It changes, evolves, and develops over time while adapting to the needs of the market. The data, a key element of competitiveness in the emergency of a globalized world, a global vision is necessary to analyze the positioning within international trade. The location of production. A country cannot have a competitive advantage in all of the sectors. However, it may have a competitive advantage on an international scale. It needs to be understood that national competitiveness can be found in a number of sectors in which the degree of competitiveness and wealth generation explains the competitive advantage. Again, Porter, foreign investment and international trade are a source of wealth and progress in productivity. Nations need to be competitive in sectors which are more dynamic and which provide greater added value, sustaining multiply national wealth. The model is represented graphically in the form of a rhombus that consists of 4 factors which provide the basis of the country's competitive advantage. Factor conditions. Porter studies the access of each country has its terms of that each country has in terms of its production factors, such as labor, infrastructure, and also how each company adapts to each productive sector. Porter says it is of great importance to get fully involved in creating, updating, and expanding production factors. Classification of production factors, according to Porter, basic factors: geographic location, unskilled labor, natural resources, climate, and capital. In other words, these are those elements that are inherited from previous situations or innate to the country. And then the specialized factors, more elaborated and advanced elements such as qualified labor, technological networks, research and development, and infrastructure. These classified factors collaborate in the development of a competitive advantage of the sector and the location. It is a very specialized and involved factor that also responds to the specific needs of the sector. Represents an added value of competitiveness, which is difficult to imitate. However, a continuous investment in financial, economic, and labor resources is definitely required. Now we come to the demand condition. Porter carries out an analysis of the demand of each product in a given country, since demand is thought to generate a sequence of needs that will oblige the companies to constantly improve their offer, quality, and expansion, and their product efficiency to ensure competitive price. This helps the company or the product sector to be in favorable conditions to compete in an international domain, thanks to the fact that its market of origin shows a high level of production efficiency. The company of a given country will obtain a competitive advantage as long as the national buyers of the product or service are well informed and demanding are high for the product quality and encourage the company to constantly enhance its offer. Related supporting industries. In the production process, there are a number of essential elements, among them suppliers, distributors, consultants, managers, etc., which lead to the creation of related supporting industries that reinforce the idea of creating a sector or a company that is competitive in the global context. An optimal relationship between the different participants in productivity process is an added value that for achieving the competitive advantage of a nation. The significance of related supporting sectors lies in the quantifiable aspects, which are fast and efficient provisioning, and the intangible assets, short lines of communication among companies, fast communication flow, continuous exchange of ideas, and innovation. This stimulates innovation through exchanging ideas. A firm strategy, structure spelled wrong, and rivalry. Porter believes that there is no universal business model, but each country in each sector and in each section will find a certain way of organizing itself so as to generate competitiveness. The internal competition of companies is key of getting these companies to compete internationally. The pursuit of competitive advantage involves a struggle between competing countries. This dynamic forces nations to multiply boost products and to boost prices to reduce costs, improve quality and service, as well as create new products and processes. Rivalry makes all the companies enjoy the same competitive advantage linked to that country, which implies an added challenge when it comes to search for new tools that may provide a competitive advantage. Rivalry between nations leads to a geographic concentration of rivals or competitors, which emphasize the fact of rivalry between companies as a result of a close and challenging competition, giving a real boost to productive factors. Porter places value on the economies of scale, which can be a competitive advantage for a company and help them to overcome other types of economic disadvantage and become a fully competitive exporter. The state's mission in market regulation. I'll come now to traditional theories about the role of the state in the economic wavered between these two extremes. Yes, here's what happened in the past. The state should not intervene in the organization of the economy, since the invisible hand will be responsible for regulating economic movements. Or the state management is a key factor in controlling and improving the production process by means of protectionism, regulations, subsidies, taxation, administration, etc. Both positions, 1 and 2, are supposed to be the best strategies for increasing competitive advantage. Porter's theory. Porter's theory came up with some ideas regarding the role of the state in the development of competitive advantage. The state must act as catalyst and stimulus. The state should not cooperate in the creation of competitive sectors, since it is responsibility of the companies. The competitive time presented by companies is not the same as that of the state. It is the state's duty to promote change, foster internal rivalry, and encourage innovation. State policies to promote competitive advantage. A, focusing on the development of specialized factors, research in universities and university-industry relationships, specify qualified education, and private investment in business investments. Non-intervention in factors in money markets. If the cost of production or exchange rate rises, they should not be lowered, since they may be a factor that drives innovation and increases companies' competitiveness. And then C, is setting strict rules on product safety and environment. This improves the productivity of companies and increases the consumer demand. It can also be a competitive advantage in their international context. Liberalization of competition, implementation of coherent and tenacious antitrust policies, rejection of regulated foreign trade. The ultimate goal of foreign trade is to open markets wherever the country has competitive advantage, as well as to actively target the emerging sectors. And then finding solutions to trade barriers. If the state discovers a trade barrier in another nation, it should overcome this difficulty without having to resort to a retaliation policy, that is, regulation of exports and imports. Competitive advantage of nations. Factors. Well, now that we take a close look at the factors that influence the creation of a competitive advantage for a country. The size of the government. The state can intervene through regulation of a very expensive tax system that distributes to management much of the international and manages much of the international income. On the other hand, states collaborate in the production processing of the company through state enterprises. It has been studied that the dimension of the state regarding the economic organization of a certain country can influence the positioning of this country in the international framework. And through the results obtained in last year's annual report, we can conclude that a large state regulating the economy is not an obstacle for the achievement of the competitive advantage in international trade. We can conclude that state structures that are very extensive, as is often the case in Europe, make their economies less competitive, and in this case, it may be said that state intervention is social and not economic. Thirdly, we can conclude that a high degree of freedom of competition and insufficient development of the welfare state does not imply success in gaining competitive advantages in the international trade. And D, there is no unique and specific prescription that illustrates improvement of the competitiveness of the economies of emerging countries in the global context. There's no unique and specific prescription that illustrates improvement to the competitiveness of in emerging countries in a global context. Now we come to monetary policy. It refers to the actions of the government, central bank, or other regulatory committees that control the money supply, and as a result, the interest, unlike she was crying. Monetary policies is one of the most important components to illustrate the economic stability of a country. we can observe the following. The degree of competitiveness or the growth of the economy cannot be explained only by the degree of control used by monetary policy. The United States and the European Union tend to score high in terms of the control index applied to their monetary policy, and this is not tantamount to high control of competitiveness in their products compared to emerging countries. The implementation of monetary policy is in emerging countries has meant a considerable growth and expansion as well as an enormous commercial boost. Although a country is not competitive in terms of its use of monetary policy, it does not mean that there are not companies in that country that are not competitive in the world market. Then we come to business activity regulation. Each country has a level of international regulation. The country's internal business activity regulation is a factor that determines the organization of its companies. The degree of competitiveness in the international context may depend on the international regulation of business activities. Examples of factors that make up business activity regulation: licenses, extraordinary costs, bureaucratic costs, administrative regulation, standards, price controls. Business regulations. According to the latest report of Economic Freedom of the World, the following conclusions can be drawn. Highly efficient business regulation is not synonymous with competitiveness of products within the international framework. International competitiveness can coexist with both the modern regulatory system and the more traditional model, as well as the export positioning. And that the United States and Spain are countries with a high percentage of trade deficit in their product economics, and that they have the same level of business regulation. In addition, they obtain benefits from the creation of national competitive advantages and also from exporting companies, which are important for the world's competitiveness. Freedom of international trade. This section is extremely important for the subject, as the freedom of international trade influences international trade activities directly. And here are the following variables to find in the international trade: the size of the commercial sector, the non-tariff trade barriers, the cost of import and export procedures, the taxes of international trade, the income tax as a percentage of imports and exports, the controls of the international capital market, and the regulatory barriers to trade. These variables define the functioning of the global merchandise trade, so that the studies on these variables clarify the current situation and trends of the future in terms of international trade. Here now is a list in terms of economic freedoms. Where in the world is Canada on that list, if at all? Oh, Canada's, ooh, that isn't even bad. Where's the USA? Ooh, wow. How far down is the USA? Oh, the United States is not bad at all. They're quite high. Okay, if that's what we mean. Yeah, okay. Well, there they are. Okay, that sounds good.